What is the most disturbing thing your kid has said when taking about their imaginary friend? My son from the age of 3 always tells me about the creeper man who lives in my mom and dad's bedroom. He brings it up after he visits them. I made the mistake once of asking what he looks like. My son said, "Oh, he doesn't have a face." Posted this before. A parent of one of my students told us in a meeting that she was concerned because her son, 7 years old, talked about an invisible ghost who would talk to him and play with him in his room. He said the ghost was called the captain and was an old white guy with a beard. The kid would tell his mom that the captain told him when he grows up his job will be to kill people, and the captain would tell him who needed to be killed. The kid would cry and say he doesn't want to kill when he grows up, but the captain tells him he doesn't have a choice and he'll get used to killing after a while. I was always creeped out working with that student after that. When my daughter was 3, she had an imaginary friend named Kelly who lived in her closet. Kelly sat in a little rocking chair while she slept, played with her, etc. Typical imaginary friend crap. Anyway, fast forward 2 years later, the wife and I are watching the new Amityville, the one with Ryan Reynolds, and our daughter walks out right when dead girl goes all black-eyed. Far from being disturbed, she said, "That looks like Kelly. Kelly who we say, you know, the dead girl that lived in my closet." I've posted the story somewhere before, but my cousin, when she was 5 and I was 17, had a stuffed rabbit that she talked to and carried everywhere. One day she was asleep on the couch while I was watching her, and she woke up and started yelling at her rabbit for no reason. 1 minute she was knocked out, the next, she's awake, glaring at her rabbit, yelling, "No, you can't do that. That's bad. Don't do it," repeatedly. I asked her what was wrong, tried to get her to stop, but she wouldn't listen. I finally just took the rabbit up to her room, and when I came back down she was asleep on the couch again. Frick, whatever that rabbit was planning on doing. Don't get me wrong, but I would keep a serious eye on the people around your cousin. This is standard behavior for abuse victims. My little brother's imaginary friend, Roger, lived under our coffee table. Roger had a wife and 9 kids. Roger and his family lived peacefully alongside us for 3 years. One day, my little brother announced that Roger wouldn't be around anymore, since he shot and killed him and his whole family. I don't know if he remembers any of this, but his genuine lack of remorse was very disturbing. My folks' farm surrounds a cemetery, and my dad and my niece were walking down there. My niece, 4, looks up and says, "What's that boy doing up in that tree?" There was no boy, but she insisted there was and could describe him. Her brother used to have an imaginary grandma Rose. He said she was dead and helped him when he was coloring. My kid only had an invisible goldfish he kept in his pocket. It never went much beyond that, so I'm assuming it wasn't a ghost fish. Well, it wasn't a ghost fish before your kid started keeping it in his pocket. When I was 16, I babysat twins who were in the 3rd grade at the time. They always spoke of a man in an Easter bunny costume, and they were terrified of him. One day I was babysitting, and one twin was in the shower. His brother and I were sitting downstairs watching television when all of a sudden, he said, "You need to go check on Matt." Seconds later, Matt yelled, "He's in here. He's in here." I ran upstairs, and I had to check every room before he would calm down. I'm not sure which part of the experience freaked me out the most. The twin connection. That crap alone freaks me out. My mum tells me that when I was around 3 or 4, I just used to sit and stare at the roof and talk to Jenny Bond, the then royal correspondent for the BBC. Not creepy disturbing, but a disturbingly crap choice in imaginary friends. I love it. About a year ago, my 4-year-old niece started talking to her imaginary friend Michael Jackson. He was with us all the time, tea parties and over our phone conversations. It was always hilarious to see a stranger's reaction when she would yell in the store, "Michael Jackson is calling," as she would whip out her payphone. He has since been replaced by Prince Eric, who is a little B if you ask me. The name Prince Eric just screams B. Talking to a 6-year-old boy in my placement classroom. Boy is working on his schoolwork and talking to someone that is by his side, but there's nothing there. Boy, stop it, I'm trying to do work. Me, what's going on? Says in a deep, dark, forceful whisper. Boy, I've been having these fantasies for 15 years, and I'm sick of it. That actually sounds kind of hilarious. When my brother was little, he acted like he had angels talking to him every second. One day my mom overheard him say, "I can't kill him. He's my only dad." Ah, the ol' reverse Abraham. I asked my 6-year-old son what he was doing and he said, "Playing with Greg," the name of his imaginary friend. Then when I asked him, "What are you guys doing?" my son responded back with, "Making babies." Note, my son has no idea. "Daddy, Greg said you can milk just about anything with nipples." Not me, but when my mom was younger she had an imaginary friend named Shaggy. When she was finished with Shaggy, she chopped him up and put him in the fridge. Moral of the story is don't cross my mom. Like, zoinks. When I was little I had a whole gang of imaginary friends, both human and animals. One day my mum noticed I hadn't talked about them in a while and asked me what happened to them, to which I replied as calmly as ever that they were in a car crash and had died. On another creepy childhood note, when my brother was just learning how to talk he grabbed one of those small toy hammers and crawled onto the sofa where my dad was sleeping. He then leant in close and whispered one of his first sentences, smashed daddy's head right into his ear. Oh my god, same happened to my imaginary friend. I was outside playing and she called our names, my name and my imaginary friend, and said dinner was ready, and then when I came in I told her she could just take his plate away because he was hit by a car and died. After that I never mentioned him again. My brother had an invisible friend named Tony Rigel. He was 6 inches tall and was elderly. One day we found my brother crying in his room. Apparently Tony Rigel had passed away in his sleep. We buried him in a shoebox in the backyard. So basically we had a funeral, complete with a moment of silence, for an empty shoebox. R.I.P. Tony Rigel. Not the parent, but the child. I don't remember how old I was, somewhere around kindergarten, but I had an imaginary friend. His name was Ash. One morning I heard my father mumble something about having sex to my mother. At the time I had no clue what he was talking about. I assumed it was something really grown up and that's why he'd said it so quietly. So, breakfast ends and I decide I want my parents to think I'm a little more of an adult than they think. And with all the swagger a young child could muster, I get up from the table and begin walking to my room. Before I'm out of the kitchen though, I casually mention to both my parents that I'm just going to be in my room with Ash having sex. I'm not gay. Well, at least this one's funny for a change. Kid I used to babysit had imaginary friends. They were dead. One had no head. One was an old lady. They were both bloody. The one with no head had insides sticking out of his neck. I didn't ask him questions about them because frick that. First reasonable response I've read. My daughter used to tell me about a man who came into her room every night and put the sign of the cross on her forehead. I thought it was just a dream. Then my mother-in-law sent over some family photos. My daughter looked right at the picture of my husband's father, who has been dead for 16 years, and said that's the man who comes into my room at night. My husband later told me his father would always do the sign of the cross on his forehead when he was young. That's so sweet, creepy in a way, but also warming, that he'd want to see his granddaughter. Not exactly creepy, but my cousin had imaginary pet chickens she called Bok Boks. For over 2 years she fed them, put them to sleep, and took them for walks. One day my father, her uncle, was visiting and she ran up to him with her hands cupped together and held out to him and said, "Look uncle," she was always making him imaginary food which he would pretend to gobble up. So he scooped the imaginary bundle from her hands, shoved it in his mouth, and pretended to gobble it up. Only when she started screaming and spewing tears did everyone realize it wasn't imaginary food, it was her Bok Boks. She was deeply sad for days and they never returned. Kids' minds amaze me. That one is entirely his fault. I would never eat imaginary food without knowing if it contains possible allergens or something toxic. I stole my username from my 6-year-old niece. It was the name of her imaginary friend. She said he was a very bad man. At least you could understand the word horror. My 7-year became fond of the word horror this past Halloween. But it sounded like W. She talked about W masks, W movies, and W houses. I did a double take every time, and I corrected her. but didn't want to get into a big explanation about what a W is. Awkward. You know that part in The Grudge when the old Japanese police chief looks behind him while on the computer? I've done that maybe 36 times since I opened this thread. In high school, one of my best friends had a little sister who was 5 or 6 years old. One day we stopped by his place, completely high, because he needed to get his magic cards. While waiting for him to come downstairs, his sister came up to me and said, "Icy told me to ask you if you know when you're going to die." I laughed nervously. Morbid question, right? But I knew all about Icy, her imaginary friend. I even helped her draw a picture of him once. So I played along and said, "No, of course not. No one knows that. Hopefully when I'm very old." The girl shook her head sadly and said, "No, Icy wants me to tell you it'll be tonight." And with that, she just walked away. If I hadn't been stoned, I probably would have laughed. Instead, I spent the rest of the evening paranoid as frick that something bad was going to happen. I'm glad you added that edit. I was worried you possessed some other child from this thread to write this for you. When my uncle was younger, he had an imaginary friend named Squirt who lived in the toilet and would come play with him after everyone went to bed. Kinky. When my niece was about 4, she had an imaginary friend, which I don't remember the name of. She would blame things she did on this imaginary friend, but also talked about how this friend would watch Scooby-Doo with her. One day I thought, why don't I find out more about this friend? So I asked her to tell me about her friend, and she said, she's a she and she's dead. And I said, okay, does she have a job? And she said, she does what my daddy does, which is that her imaginary friend was a cop. Okay. So then I said, where is your imaginary friend a policewoman at? And she said, right next to where my daddy is a policeman. And I said, okay. But then she said, I met her when I was in my mummy's belly. She touched it when I was inside. A few months before my niece was born, my cousin Tracy had died. She was hit by a train. She loved watching Scooby-Doo and had a ton of memorabilia. She was also a cop. She was a cop in the town that is right next to the one my brother-in-law is a cop in. My niece's daddy, my niece's imaginary friend, was my dead cousin. There is no other way she could have known all that at the age of 4. I had lots of imaginary friends when I moved to a new country. Since I didn't at all have any real friends, I made up friends. But just like me, they were afraid of being rejected and laughed at. I had this vision that all the people that were mean to us will go to heck and burn. My grandmom had no idea of these friends. Once when we were sitting, eating dinner, my parents were out somewhere. I said something along the lines of, hey, are you not hungry? Eat now. Mind you, I was also staring at an empty chair. My grandmom looked at me weirdly, thinking I was talking to her, but before she managed to ask me anything, I spoke again. Eat up, Thomas. They might be laughing now, but they won't be laughing once they are all on fire and I resumed eating. Oh, the look on my grandmom's face. For a whole year she tried proving to my mom that I was possessed by the devil. TLDR. Nobody laughs once I turned them to ashes. I definitely laughed at this. I can only imagine what your poor grandma went through trying to convince your mom. My wife and I overheard my 2-year daughter on the baby monitor wake up on Saturday morning and say, what? Okay, I'll tell her, then get up and come into our bedroom and told my wife, Mary says you're doing a good job. Mary was her grandmother that she was extremely close to that passed away. That is extremely sweet. Pretty creepy, but sweet. When my boy was 4, his imaginary friend would sit in the corner of the room when you switched off the lights and light the room with red glowing eyes. Apparently. Nope. Sorry, son. You'll have to figure this one out on your own. Daddy, don't frick with that crap. You're the man of the house now. Take care of your mother. When I was about 4, I had an imaginary friend named Bomber. I remember pretty well that he wore a purple turban and had darker skin. I made my mom set a place for him at the dinner table and scooched to the edge of my bed every night to make room for him for months. For my dad's birthday that summer, my parents had a party. We had a small pool, and by this point I was allowed to be in the shallow end with my water wings if an adult was watching me. With the adults all distracted, though, I decided to break the rules and go in without my wings or supervision. Someone noticed me underwater pretty soon after, head under but my legs kicking toward the edge. My dad jumped in, fully clothed, and pulled me out. Fuss ensued. When it was clear I was alright, the first thing I said to my mom was Bomba told me to just keep kicking. That I'd make it to the edge if I just kept kicking. The next day, when my mom was setting the table, I stopped her when I saw her set Bomba's place. He was gone and I guess I stopped speaking of him after that. TLDR. My imaginary friend saved my life then dipped out. A bro is a bro, even when imaginary. I am the kid in this story. When I was about 5-6, I told my dad that I remembered stuff from before I was adopted. Mind you, my parents got me when I was 10 days old. I didn't know anything about my birth parents until I was 8-9 and read through some paperwork. Anyway, I told my dad what it was like inside my other mom. I said stuff like there was really loud music, late nights, and dogs barking. I even gave him the name of the dog, which I cannot for the life of me remember right now, but I do remember it was not a typical dog name. My dad says it gave him goosebumps because he knew my biological mother was a college student and I was describing a typical college lifestyle. Fast forward to the year I turned 21 and found my biological mother. I asked her a few things and it turns out she went to a concert when she was later on in her pregnancy and remembered me being very active to the music. She also spent late nights up drawing a picture of her mother and baby, which I now own a copy of, and she remembers me also being very active during those times. But the weirdest thing was that she did live with 2 dogs. I called my dad when I was talking to her and said, "Dad, the dog's name was it?" He went silent. Same freaking name. Now I need to call my bio mom and ask her what that was again. Not my kid, but something my mum said I did when I was little. I had this imaginary friend named Joe. Was pretty normal imaginary friend stuff to begin with. My parents would ask about him and I'd respond with something like, "I like Joe, he has curly black hair, he likes to play outside, nothing interesting." Until one day I come out with, "Joe has to work a lot, but Joe's boss doesn't like him." When asked why, I responded with, "Oh, it's because Joe's black," as if it was obvious. Now this wouldn't have been weird if I hadn't grown up in a very small all-white town, and I was about 3 years old. I didn't know, or rather, hadn't been taught, that racism was even a thing. This continued on for a while. I'd mention Joe now and then, sometimes talking about what he did for fun, or his favorite things, other times mentioning that his boss hits him and shouts all the time. After a few months, I go up to my mum one day and have a conversation that went something like this. "Joe's really happy today. His boss isn't coming back. Why? He's dead." "Oh yes? How did he die?" "He hung himself from up there," as I point up towards the attic door. I don't remember much of this. I definitely remember having an imaginary friend named Joe. The rest of it, not so much. An exchange between one of the students, 5 years old, in my student teaching placement and myself. Me: "What do you want to write about?" Her: "Jack." Me: "Oh, who's Jack?" Her: "He is my invisible friend." Me: "Oh, okay, tell me something about Jack." Her: "He's dead. My cousin died when he was 6, and my brother was maybe 2-3 months old. When he was around 3, my brother started playing with those little car mats with the towns on them, and cars, and talking to himself. When my mom asked who he was playing with, he calmly said my dead cousin's name." So eerie. From another thread, the rare occasions in which small children have alluded to having violent experiences that led to previous deaths freak me the frick out. The most detailed one I ever heard was actually delivered second-hand through my friend's mother, apparently beginning around the time my friend could form sentences until he was little more than 2. He would go on and on about how he was a Native American named Conchin and that after his wife and son got sick and died, he moved to a mountain to live by himself with his horse. He died of a broken neck when he fell into a ravine. Weird crap, man. So, when my sister was probably about 6 or 7, she had an imaginary friend named Emily. She told us Emily lived in her closet, wore an old black dress, and had long dark hair, and she was the same age as my sister. My sister played with Emily constantly. My parents started noticing my sister acting weird, just sitting in the middle of her room whispering to Emily quite a bit and acting a lot more distant towards them. I remember a very specific day, my brother was walking by her room and my sister was sitting in the middle of her room, but she turned around and hissed at him. He was scared shitless. He told me it didn't even look like my sister. My parents ran up to her room and I could hear my sister just screaming and screaming as loud as she get out. I have no idea what happened in that room, but I ran to the bottom of my stairs and the screaming stopped. I saw my parents holding my sister crying their eyes out. She was sobbing as well. I've asked her about it today. She's 24 now. She told me that Emily used to tell her to do horrible things to herself. She actually used to wake up on the roof and not remember how she got there. I'm not kidding. Apparently Emily absolutely hated my parents, so she turned my sister against them. She hates talking about it, so I never brought up that specific night. This all happened at my old house. When we moved into a different house, Emily was gone. I'm not making any of this up. My sister's little friend was a really big deal to my family and messed things up for a long time. I'm just relieved we left that house. I was 17 and babysitting a friend of the family's 6-year-old. He'd been in bed a couple of hours and I just peeked in to check on him. He wasn't in the bed, and when I opened the door wider, I saw he was standing in the corner, facing the wall. Creepiest freaking thing ever. I asked him what he was doing and all he did was turn around, smile, and put his finger to his lips as if to say SHHH. I asked him again what he was doing and all he says is, "Leave us. It is the punishment." When my niece was 2, her grandfather, my father, died. A few months later, she started the phase of talking to herself, imaginary friends and such. One day, I asked her who she was talking to. She replied, "I'm talking to the man." I asked what the man looked like, and she described my dad perfectly. I asked if he had a name, and she gave my father's name, even though she only knew him as Grandpa. The creepiest part was when she told my mother that the man told her where his lost wedding ring was, which she had been looking for since he passed. It was right where she said. This December will be 10 years that my grandma died. My nephew, who is 9, tells us a few times a year that the lady in a white coat, she had a white puffy coat, is in my parents' kitchen. He's described her perfectly. It's eerie. My adopted Chinese sister had an imaginary friend named Emily when she was little. Emily was from China, too, and she had been in the orphanage with my sister. My sister would talk about her like they were lifelong friends who'd never been apart. Once, when we went on vacation to Italy, Emily came with us. It was kinda cute, but got annoying. I was 14 and didn't deal with my 4-year-old sister's babbling to her friend very well, so I got snappy with her a few times. One day, when we were in Assisi, we ran into another American family with an adopted Chinese daughter, around the same age as my sister. My parents started talking to them and it ended up that the girl came from the same town, and the same orphanage, and her name was Emily. My sister freaked the frick out, basically turning white as a ghost. She knew that her Emily wasn't real, but here was another Emily who fit her exact description, living in the flesh. She didn't talk for the rest of the day. After that, she quickly rebounded and would talk about how great it was that we all got to meet her friend Emily in Assisi. I'm a geriatric nurse, and when I was pregnant with my twins, one of my favorite patients, Josie, was thrilled I was having baby soon. She was a colorful woman to say the least, but loved me because if she did what I asked, I'd sneak her a cigarette now and then. She wore wide-brimmed hats and burged red lipstick. Every morning she'd come to my desk and say, "How you're doing, honey?" Josie died shortly after my girls were born. One day, one of my twins put on a big hat and was walking around the house saying, "How you're doing, honey?" I just thanked Josie for coming to see me one last time and went about my day. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.